The metallic halls of the Galactic Academy hummed with the chatter of 1,000 different species as students from across the known universe gathered for another cycle of learning, and Zara pressed her shoulders back with pride as she walked through the corridors with her fins fluttering slightly behind her elegant blue head. She was a Valorian, and her people were known throughout the galaxy as one of the most advanced civilizations to ever achieve space travel, and her species had mastered faster-than-light travel 3,000 years before most other races had even discovered fire. And she carried that legacy with her in every confident step she took through the pristine academy hallways. The morning light filtered through the transparent aluminum windows as Zara made her way to her advanced physics class, and she noticed a new student sitting in the back corner of the lecture hall, and he looked so plain and unremarkable that she almost dismissed him entirely from her thoughts. His skin was a strange pale peachy color unlike anything she had seen before, and he had hair that was dark brown and messy, in a way that suggested he did not care much about his appearance, and his eyes were a muddy color that seemed to shift between brown and green depending on the light. And he sat hunched over a primitive-looking data pad, taking notes with his fingers, instead of using a neural link like everyone else. Zara slid into her usual seat near the front of the class, and she leaned over to her friend Kessa, who was a crystalline being from the Shard Worlds, and she whispered with barely concealed amusement in her voice. The new one in the back looks like he crawled out of a cave somewhere. Kessa turned her faceted head slightly, and her internal light pulsed with what passed for laughter among her kind, and she responded in a musical tone. I heard he is from some backwater planet in the Outer Rim, and apparently his species only achieved space travel a few decades ago. Zara felt a wave of superiority wash over her, and she could not imagine being so primitive, and her own people had been exploring the stars for millennia, and they had built empires, and fallen, and rebuilt them again. While this creature's ancestors were probably still learning to make tools, the professor entered the room and the class fell silent, and the lesson began with complex equations about quantum entanglement and wormhole stabilization, and Zara absorbed the information easily through her neural implant while she noticed the human in the back was still manually writing notes on his archaic device. During the break between lectures, Zara approached the human with Kessa following close behind, and she wanted to satisfy her curiosity about this strange primitive creature who had somehow managed to gain entry to the most prestigious educational institution in the galaxy. She stood in front of his desk and looked down at him with her violet eyes gleaming with poorly hidden contempt, and she said in a voice that dripped with false sweetness, "You are new here, and I am Zara from Valoria, and you are." The human looked up at her, and his expression was neutral and polite, and he said in a voice that was surprisingly steady, "My name is Jake, and I am from Earth." Zara repeated the word as if it tasted strange in her mouth, and she had never heard of such a place, and she glanced at Kessa, who shimmered with equal confusion. "Is that in the outer territories somewhere?" Jake nodded slowly, and he seemed unbothered by her obvious condescension, and he replied, "Yes, it is in what you would call the Sol system, and we are relatively new to interstellar travel." Zara laughed, and it was a tinkling sound like bells. But there was cruelty in it, and she said with mock sympathy, "That must be so difficult for you, and all of this technology must seem like magic to someone from such a primitive world." Jake looked at her for a long moment, and something flickered in his eyes, but he simply smiled and said, "We manage over the following weeks." Zara made it her mission to remind Jake of his inferior status at every opportunity, and when he struggled with the neural interface, she laughed and told him that perhaps manual writing was more his speed, and when he arrived late to class because he got lost in the massive academy complex, she suggested that maybe someone should draw him a map with pictures, since reading holographic directories was clearly too advanced for him. Her friends joined in the mockery, and they found it endlessly amusing that someone so backward had been admitted to their elite institution, and they whispered jokes about primitive humans and their slow technology and their laughable history that barely spanned a few thousand years of recorded civilization. Jake never responded to their taunts, and he simply continued attending classes and taking his manual notes and working on his assignments with quiet determination, and his silence only made Zara more bold in her ridicule because she interpreted it as confirmation of his inferiority. One day in combat theory class, the professor announced a simulation exercise, and students would be paired randomly to compete in various tactical scenarios, and Zara felt a surge of excitement because she excelled at strategy, and her people had perfected the art of warfare over countless generations. When the pairings were announced, Zara felt her confidence soar when she learned she would be facing Jake in a one-on-one tactical simulation, and this would be the perfect opportunity to demonstrate the vast gulf between their civilizations, and she would crush him completely, and maybe then he would understand that he did not belong among the galactic elite. The simulation took place in a virtual environment that recreated a hostile planet with limited resources and unpredictable terrain, and each participant would command a small squad of units. And the objective was simple: and eliminate the opponent's command center. Zara entered her simulation pod with supreme confidence, and she had trained for scenarios like this her entire life, and her people had tactical databases spanning thousands of years of military history, and she had access to all of it through her neural implant. The simulation began, and Zara immediately implemented a classic Valorian pincer strategy, and she divided her forces and began a methodical advance on multiple fronts, and her movements were textbook perfect, and they followed proven patterns that had won countless real battles throughout galactic history. She expected to encounter Jake's forces quickly, and she anticipated clumsy defensive positions and poor resource management, and instead she found nothing, and his units seemed to have vanished into the terrain. Confusion flickered through her mind as she expanded her search pattern. And where was he, and what was he doing? And she pushed deeper into the virtual landscape, and her forces spread thin as she searched for an opponent who refused to reveal himself. Then everything went wrong at once. Her left flank suddenly came under withering fire from a position she had already cleared. And how was that possible? And she had swept that sector thoroughly, and her units began taking casualties, and she rushed reinforcements to shore up the collapsing line. Before her reinforcements arrived, her right flank erupted in chaos as explosions tore through her advancing column, and Jake had somehow positioned explosives along the route she had chosen and the route she had selected, because it was the tactically optimal path, and he had predicted her movements exactly. Panic crept into her thoughts as she tried to regroup her scattered forces, and Jake's attacks came from everywhere and nowhere, and small units hitting hard and disappearing before she could respond, and her superior numbers meant nothing when she could not bring them to bear. Her command centers, shields started taking damage, and how had he gotten units past her entire army? And she frantically pulled back her forces to defend her base. But it was too late, and Jake's forces had infiltrated through routes she had not even considered, and moving through terrain she had dismissed as impassable. The simulation ended with her command center in ruins, and Zara sat in stunned silence inside her pod, and she had lost badly, and the human had dismantled her forces with surgical precision. She emerged from the pod to find Jake already standing outside his, and he looked calm and unsurprised, and he nodded to her politely and said, "Good match." Zara could not speak, and humiliation burned through her. And how had this primitive creature defeated her? And around the simulation room, other students were staring at the results display with disbelief. And the human had achieved a decisive victory against one of their best tactical students. Professor Thane approached them, and, his insectoid features unreadable, and he addressed the class. Let this be a lesson, and victory does not always favor the most advanced technology, or the longest military tradition, and adaptability, and unpredictability, and unconventional thinking, and these qualities can overcome even the most sophisticated opponent. Zara wanted to sink through the floor as her friends whispered among themselves, and Kessa dimmed her internal light in sympathetic embarrassment, and the human had made her look like a fool. In the days that followed, Zara found herself watching Jake more carefully, and she told herself it was to understand what had happened and to find the flaw in his tactics so she could defeat him if they ever faced each other again. But truthfully, something had shifted in her perception. She noticed how Jake approached problems differently than other students, and when faced with a complex engineering challenge, he did not immediately access vast databases of existing solutions, and instead he would sit quietly and think, and working through the problem with his own mind before consulting any external resources. She observed him in the Academy's workshop building something with his hands, and actual physical work that most species considered beneath them, and he was constructing a small device from basic components, and his fingers moving with surprising dexterity and precision. Curiosity finally overcame her pride, and she approached him, and she kept her voice neutral as she asked, "What are you making?" Jake looked up, and he was surprised by her civil tone. He did not show it, and he held up a partially assembled object and said, "A music player, and the one I brought from Earth broke, and the replacement parts are not compatible with local technology. So I am building a new one." Zara stared at him, and he was building complex electronics from scratch, and most students would simply fabricate a new device using the Academy's molecular assemblers. And she asked, despite herself, "You know how to do that?" Jake shrugged and replied, "On Earth. We have to learn how things work because our technology is not as automated as most galactic standard equipment. And if something breaks, we need to be able to fix it ourselves." A thought occurred to Zara, and one she had never considered before. And she asked slowly, "Is that why you won the simulation, and because you think differently?" Jake paused in his work, and he seemed to consider his answer carefully, and then he said, "Maybe, and on Earth we have had to be creative because we do not have the advantages other civilizations have, and we cannot rely on technology to solve every problem. So we learned to adapt." Zara felt something uncomfortable twist in her chest, and shame perhaps, and all this time she had mocked him for being primitive, but maybe primitive and innovative were not the same thing. She found herself returning to the workshop over the following days, and at first she told herself she was just curious about human engineering techniques. But gradually, she admitted she wanted to understand Jake better, and the human who had so thoroughly defeated her. Jake seemed content to let her watch him work, and he answered her questions without the defensiveness she would have expected. And he explained how Earth technology had developed along different paths than galactic standard, and how humans had to make do with limited resources and hostile environments. One evening, as Jake soldered tiny components onto a circuit board, Zara asked the question that had been bothering her. "Why did you come here into the Academy, and your people are so new to space travel, and you must know what others think of humans?" Jake set down his tools, and he looked at her directly, and he said, "Because we want to learn. And Earth joined the galactic community because we knew we had a lot to catch up on. And yes, people look down on us, and yes, the technology gap is enormous. But that does not mean we should not try." There was no bitterness in his voice and no anger, and just simple determination, and Zara felt a strange respect growing inside her. She asked another question. "Does it bother you, and the way others treat you?" Jake smiled slightly, and he replied, "At first, yes, but I realized something, and species that have had space travel for thousands of years forget what it was like to struggle, and they forget what it was like to have nothing, and to build everything from scratch, and humans remember, and maybe that is our advantage." Zara thought about that for a long time after she left the workshop, and her people had been powerful for so long that they had become complacent, and they relied on their technology and their databases and their established knowledge, but they had stopped innovating centuries ago. The next day in xenobiology class, the professor presented a problem that had stumped researchers for decades, and a deadly plague was spreading through a colony world, and the standard medical interventions were not working, and students were asked to propose solutions. Zara immediately accessed her neural database, and she searched through thousands of documented cases, and looking for similar patterns, and around her other students were doing the same, and consulting the vast accumulated knowledge of their civilizations. Jake sat quietly with his eyes closed, and he was thinking. After 20 minutes, students began presenting their solutions, and most suggested variations on existing treatments and minor modifications to known protocols, and the professor rejected each one, and explaining why those approaches had already been tried and failed. Then Jake raised his hand. The professor gestured for him to speak, and Jake said, "What if we are approaching this wrong, and what if, instead of treating the plague directly, we modify the patients?" The class erupted in murmurs, and Kessa chimed musically. "That is absurd, and you cannot just modify an entire population." But Jake continued, "On Earth, we have a saying, and if you cannot change the situation, change yourself. And what if we introduce a benign virus that temporarily alters the colonists' biochemistry, and making them inhospitable hosts for the plague, and just long enough for it to die out?" The professor's antennae quivered with interest, and he said slowly, "That is, and highly unorthodox, and no database would suggest such a solution. and it violates several standard medical protocols. Jake nodded and agreed, yes, but would it work? The professor consulted his datapad, and he ran simulations, and the class waited in tense silence, and finally he looked up and his compound eyes gleaming. Theoretically, yes, and this approach might actually work, and it would require extensive testing. But the basic principle is sound. The professor looked at Jake with new respect, and he announced to the class, "This is why we accept students from developing worlds, and they bring perspectives that we have forgotten. And innovation often comes from those who have not yet learned what is supposed to be impossible." After class, Zara caught up with Jake in the corridor, and she struggled to find the right words, and finally she said, "I owe you an apology, and I have been cruel to you since you arrived, and I judged you without knowing anything about you or your world." Jake looked at her, and his expression softening, and he said, "Thank you for saying that," Zara continued, and the words spilling out. "Now I was wrong about Earth and about humans, and you are not primitive, and you are just different. And maybe better in some ways." Jake shook his head and replied, "Not better and just different like you said. And every civilization has strengths, and Valoria has achieved incredible things, and Earth has a lot to learn from peoples like yours." His generosity made Zara feel even worse about her previous behavior, and she asked, "Can we start over, and I would like to learn more about Earth and about humans?" Jake smiled, and it was warm and genuine, and he said, "I would like that." Over the weeks that followed, Zara and Jake became unlikely friends, and she learned about Earth's complicated history, and its countless cultures and languages, and its remarkable diversity. And Jake told her stories about human achievement and about artists and scientists and explorers who had pushed boundaries despite having no advanced technology to help them. She learned about humans who had crossed vast oceans in wooden ships, and who had climbed the highest mountains with nothing but rope and determination, and who had sent machines to other planets decades before they could travel there themselves. Jake showed her human music and art and literature, and Zara was struck by the depth of emotion in human creative works, and her own people's art had become abstract and intellectual over the centuries, but human art was raw and powerful and deeply feeling. In return, Zara shared Valorian culture with Jake, and she showed him the mathematical beauty of Valorian architecture and the logical elegance of Valorian philosophy. And Jake appreciated it all with genuine interest, even though he sometimes struggled to understand concepts that Zara had absorbed since childhood. They began studying together, and Zara found that Jake's different perspective helped her see problems in new ways, and when she got stuck thinking in established patterns, Jake would suggest approaches that seemed absurd at first, but often led to breakthrough insights. Kessa noticed the change in Zara, and one day she pulsed with curiosity and asked, "You spend much time with the human now?" And what changed? Zara thought about her answer, and she said slowly, "I learned that being advanced and being superior are not the same thing, and humans may not have our technology, but they have something we lost, and they still know how to innovate and how to adapt and how to survive against impossible odds." Kessa dimmed thoughtfully, and she chimed, "Perhaps we should all pay more attention to Earth." News of Jake's unconventional problem-solving spread through the academy, and professors began calling on him specifically when traditional approaches failed, and other students started to see humans differently, and a few even approached Jake to ask about Earth and its people. One day, Zara and Jake were working on a joint project in the library and trying to design a more efficient power distribution system for starship engines, and Zara had exhausted her database of existing designs, and nothing met the project's requirements. She sighed in frustration and admitted, "I cannot find a solution, and every configuration I try has critical flaws." Jake looked at the holographic display, and he studied the problem, and then he asked, "What if we are thinking about this wrong? And what if instead of distributing power more efficiently, we reduce the need for power distribution?" Zara blinked and confused. "I do not understand." Jake gestured at the display, and he explained, "Right now we are trying to send power from a central reactor to systems throughout the ship, but what if each major system had its own small reactor? And localized power generation." Zara immediately saw the problems with that approach, and she said, "That would require miniaturizing reactor technology, and current reactors cannot be made smaller without losing efficiency." But Jake persisted. "Not with current reactor technology, and But what if we used a different type of reactor entirely, and something designed specifically for small-scale generation? He pulled up information about experimental Earth technology and thorium reactors and hydrogen fuel cells and technologies that galactic civilization had abandoned millennia ago in favor of more powerful but less flexible solutions. As they worked through the calculations, Zara realized Jake might be onto something, and by combining human small-scale technology with Valorian efficiency improvements, they could create something genuinely new. They worked late into the night, and their excitement building as the design took shape. And when they finally had a working prototype design, Zara sat back in amazement. This could revolutionize starship engineering. Jake grinned and replied, "Sometimes the old ways and the new ways work better together than either one alone." They presented their project to the class, and Professor Thane examined their work carefully, and his antennae quivering with increasing excitement, and finally he announced, "This is exceptional work, and you two have created something truly innovative, and I am forwarding this to the Academy's research division, and this deserves serious consideration for practical application." Zara felt a surge of pride, and not just in their accomplishment but in Jake, and the human who everyone had dismissed and who had proven himself time and again through creativity and determination and hard work. After class, Zara asked Jake, "Do you think Earth will be okay in joining the galactic community? I mean, and there is so much your people do not know yet." Jake considered, and then said, "I think we will be fine, and humans are good at adaptation, and we have survived ice ages and plagues and wars and natural disasters, and we have built civilizations in deserts and jungles and frozen wastelands, and we always find a way." He paused and added, "Besides, we have something most other species have forgotten." "What is that?" "The memory of hardship, and we know what it is like to struggle and to have nothing and to build everything ourselves. And that makes us hungry and driven and creative in ways that comfortable civilizations are not." Zara thought about the Valorian Empire, and her people were powerful and advanced and comfortable, and perhaps too comfortable, and they had stopped pushing boundaries centuries ago, and they simply refined existing knowledge rather than seeking new frontiers. She said quietly, "I think Earth has a lot to teach the galaxy." Jake smiled and he replied, "And the galaxy has a lot to teach Earth. And that is why this works, and that is why the galactic community is stronger with all of us in it." As the academic cycle continued, Zara found herself defending humans when other students mocked them, and she challenged assumptions about primitive species. And she argued that technological development and intelligence were not the same thing. Some of her friends thought she had gone too far, and Kessa dimmed disapprovingly and chimed, "You defend humans as if they are equals to the elder races." Zara looked at her friend and she said firmly, "They are equals, and maybe not in technology but in everything that matters, and intelligence, and creativity and determination and heart." She continued, "We mock them for being primitive, but they achieved space travel with mathematics. They calculated themselves, and with computers that were less powerful than a modern data pad, and with ships that were barely more than metal shells with engines attached, and do you know what that takes and what kind of brilliance and courage?" Kessa pulsed uncertainly, and other students listening nearby shifted uncomfortably, and Zara pressed on. "Our ancestors achieved space travel with the advantage of thousands of years of accumulated knowledge and advanced materials, and powerful computers, and humans did it in less than a century from the first powered flight to landing on their own moon, and while fighting wars and dealing with plagues and social upheaval." She looked around at the assembled students and she said, "If you gave any of us the limited resources humans had and asked us to reach the stars, we would fail, and we would not even know where to begin without our databases and our established knowledge, and humans had none of that, and they did it anyway." The corridor fell silent and students looked at each other, and perhaps seeing humans in a new light for the first time. Jake found Zara later and he said quietly, "You did not have to do that." Zara met his eyes and she replied, "Yes, I did. And I was wrong about humans and about you. And I will not let others make the same mistake." Jake smiled, and there was real warmth in it, and he said, "Thank you." As final examinations approached, Zara felt nervous for the first time in her academic career, and she had always relied on her neural implants and her access to vast databases, and her people's accumulated knowledge. But the hardest exams required original thinking and genuine problem-solving, and she was not sure she was as prepared as she thought. Jake noticed her anxiety, and he offered to study with her, and she accepted gratefully, and they spent long hours in the library working through practice problems. Jake taught her techniques humans used when they did not have access to external databases, and how to break complex problems into smaller, manageable pieces, and how to approach challenges from multiple angles, and how to trust her own reasoning instead of always defaulting to established solutions. Zara was surprised by how much these simple techniques helped, and she had become so dependent on technology that she had forgotten how to think independently. The day of the advanced physics exam arrived, and Zara sat in the testing chamber with her neural implant disabled, as per examination protocols, and the questions appeared on her display, and they were brutally difficult. She felt panic rising as she realized none of the questions could be answered by simply recalling information, and they all required creative application of principles, and exactly what Jake had been teaching her. She took a deep breath and remembered Jake's advice and break it down, and approach it step by step and trust yourself. Slowly, she began working through the problems and applying principles she understood, and building solutions from first principles when established methods did not work. And it was harder than relying on her implant, but it was also strangely satisfying. When the exam ended, Zara felt exhausted but cautiously optimistic, and she had done her best, and whether that was good enough she would have to wait to find out. Results were posted a week later, and Zara stared at her scores in disbelief, and she had achieved the highest marks in the class, and she had outperformed everyone, including students, who had been relying on their implants for years. Jake congratulated her and his pleasure in her success obvious, and he said, "See, and you did not need all those databases, and you had everything you needed right here." He tapped his temple and smiled. Zara felt tears forming in her eyes, and among her people crying was rare, and she said, "You taught me that, and you showed me how to think for myself again." Jake shook his head and replied, "I just reminded you, and you always had that ability, and you had just forgotten how to use it." At the end of cycle ceremony, the Academy's Chancellor presented awards for exceptional achievement, and Zara received recognition for her examination scores. And Jake received a special commendation for innovative thinking and contribution to galactic knowledge. As they stood together on the stage with the assembled students and faculty applauding, Zara reflected on how much had changed since that first day, when she had mocked the primitive human in the back of the class. She had learned that true advancement was not about how much technology you possessed, or how long your civilization had existed, and it was about remaining curious and adaptable, and willing to learn, and willing to see value in perspectives different from your own. After the ceremony, Zara and Jake walked through the Academy gardens, under the light of 3 moons, and Zara said, "I have been thinking about what happens next and after we graduate." Jake looked at her and curious. "What do you mean?" Zara took a breath and explained, "My people will expect me to return to Valoria and to take a position in government or academia, and to contribute to the Empire as my family has done for generations." She paused and continued, "But I think I want something different, and I want to go to Earth." Jake stopped walking, and he stared at her in surprise. "Earth, and why?" Zara smiled, and she said, "Because I want to learn more, and I want to understand how humans think and how they solve problems, and how they built a civilization from nothing, and I want to study human innovation, so I can bring those lessons back to my people." She added, "We have become too comfortable and too reliant on old knowledge, and we need to remember how to innovate, and humans can teach us that." Jake was quiet for a moment, and then he said, "You would be welcome on Earth, and I am sure there are many universities that would be honored to have a Valorian scholar." Zara felt relief wash over her, and she had worried he might think her presumptuous, and she said, "And maybe you could show me around and help me understand your world." Jake grinned and replied, "I would like that very much," as they continued walking. Zara thought about the future and about the bridge she wanted to build between their peoples, and about all the things humans and Valorians could learn from each other. She had come to the Academy believing her people were superior, and that less advanced species had nothing to offer, and Jake had proven her wrong in every possible way. He had shown her that innovation came from necessity, and that creativity flourished in adversity, and that true intelligence was not about how much you knew, but about how well you could think and adapt and grow. Zara looked at Jake and the human who had become her closest friend and her teacher and her equal, and she said, "Thank you for what? For teaching me to see past my own arrogance and for showing me that every civilization has value regardless of how advanced their technology is, and for being patient with me even when I was cruel." Jake smiled and he said, "You taught me things too." "Like what?" "That advancement is not just about innovation, and established knowledge has value, and the wisdom accumulated over thousands of years matters, and humans are so focused on pushing forward that sometimes we forget to learn from those who came before." He continued, "We need each other, and humans, and Valorians, and all the species in the galactic community, and we are stronger together than any of us could be alone." Zara nodded, and she felt hope blooming in her chest, and hope for the future, and for the friendships between species, and for the incredible things they could accomplish together. As they returned to their dormitories, Zara felt grateful for the journey she had taken, and from arrogant superiority to humble appreciation, and from mockery to friendship, and from blindness to understanding. She had learned that being advanced meant more than having superior technology, and it meant being wise enough to recognize value in others, and humble enough to learn from anyone, and courageous enough to admit when you were wrong. And she had learned it all from Jake and the human from Earth and the supposedly primitive species that had more to teach the galaxy than anyone had imagined. The next morning, Zara found Jake in the workshop one last time before they departed for their respective homes, and he was working on a new project and something small and intricate. "What are you making now?" Jake held up a small crystal device and he said, "A gift for you, and it is a data storage crystal, and with recordings of Earth music and human history and literature and everything. I thought might help you understand my world better." Zara felt warmth spread through her chest, and she reached into her bag and pulled out a similar crystal. "I made something for you too, and it contains Valorian mathematical proofs and philosophical texts and cultural records, and I thought you might want to learn more about my people." They exchanged gifts, and Jake said, "I will miss studying with you." Zara replied, "This is not goodbye, and it is just the beginning, and we will see each other again." Jake nodded and agreed. "Yes, we will, and Earth is waiting for you, and whenever you are ready." Zara smiled and she said, "And Valoria will welcome you if you ever want to visit, and my family would be honored to meet the human who taught their daughter humility." As they parted ways, Zara felt not sadness, but anticipation, and the galaxy was vast and full of possibilities, and she had found a friend who had changed her life and changed how she saw the universe. She had come to the academy believing she knew everything, and she was leaving, having learned the most important lesson of all. And that wisdom came not from knowing all the answers, but from remaining open to learning from everyone, and especially from those you least expected to teach you. And somewhere in the vast reaches of space, Earth continued its journey, among the stars, and young and hungry and full of the kind of innovation that came from necessity, and bringing fresh perspectives to a galaxy that had forgotten what it meant to struggle and to dream, and to reach for the impossible. Zara walked toward her transport ship, knowing that she would return to Earth someday, and knowing that humans and Valorians together would accomplish things neither species could achieve alone, and knowing that she had found in Jake not just a friend, but a bridge between worlds. The future was bright and full of promise, and it belonged to all of them.